Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining Columbia Riverkeeper for this webinar on what is the GTN Express pipeline. My name is Anna, and I'm the field manager for Columbia Riverkeeper. I'll be moderating for today, and I'm incredibly excited for today's webinar. Today we'll be joined by Brett Vanden Heuvel, our former executive director, who has worked to fight fossil fuels over the last 15 years, and Audrey Leonard, our new staff attorney at CRK, who works on protecting the Columbia from fracked gas, oil by rail, and other fossil fuel infrastructure. So just so we get used to using the chat, let's have folks drop in the chat their name, where they're listening from, and maybe your favorite summertime beverage, if you want to share with us. And you should find the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So what we have today looking like is, for today's webinar, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement, which is a practice that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And then we'll have Brett join us, and he is going to share information about the GTN Express pipeline and why this issue is important to Columbia Riverkeeper, followed by Audrey, who will be speaking about important points to be aware of in the current draft environmental impact statement that was released. And then we'll have a moment for the audience to ask questions. And lastly, we'll end our webinar with how you can stay engaged with the campaign and how to get involved. So I'm going to direct us to our land acknowledgement. Next slide. So we at Columbia Riverkeeper recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge that the places we are joining today's webinar from rest on the traditional lands of Native people who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. I'm joining today from my home in Portland, Oregon, which rests on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes in this area. So we're off to an early start, so I'm gonna hand it over to Brett Vanden Heuvel, who's going to be talking about GTN. So he may have left CRK, but he still cares very much about these issues. Brett.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Anna. So a pipeline company called TC Energy wants to send more fracked gas into the Pacific Northwest by expanding the capacity of their pipeline. So the punchline of the talk today is that our climate cannot afford more fossil fuels, and we will fight this dangerous proposal. I'll share a little bit about myself in relation to this work. So I started as staff attorney in 2007 with Columbia Riverkeeper, and I served as executive director. And I've had the honor of challenging pipeline proposals like this in court over the years, as well as other fossil fuel infrastructure. I studied geology in college until I realized that most of the jobs were in the oil and gas industry. And so now I get to fight the oil and gas industry. And this year I started a consulting practice to work on climate issues across the US. So Riverkeeper has fought large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure for the last decade, from liquefied natural gas to coal to oil terminals, methanol, new pipelines, and thanks to our amazing members and partner organizations, and thanks to the incredible work of tribal nations that we've worked in solidarity with, we have together defeated every single new fossil fuel project on the Columbia River. But the work is not done, and that's why we're here today. The GTN Xpress is another big fossil fuel projects. So thank you for being here today. It's important. So like Anna said, if you have questions or comments, if you want to put them in the chat, if you have anything you want to share from your experiences, and we can discuss them along the way. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about where this new frac gas for the GTN Express would come from and where it's going. And we can put GTN in the bigger context of the frac gas supply chain and think about the regional and global impacts. And so the schematic along the bottom of this slide shows a supply chain that goes from production, the fracking, all the way to making plastics. And we're going to have to save the petrochemical and plastic slideshow webinar for another time, but I wanted to emphasize this connection between fracked gas and plastic pollution, which is the end result of some of the fracking. But we're going to start at the beginning and talk about methane and talk about fracking and how this gas is getting into our region. So this photo is a well pad, a frac pad, and as you know, fracking involves really extensive infrastructure. There's a lot of pollution that comes from this alone. So 200 tanker trucks of water, there's fracking fluid, you know, the well is down thousands of feet, and then for fracking it turns horizontal and it's pumped in with pressure and fracking fluid that cracks the rock layers, cracks the sediments, and is then filled with frac sand to allow them to pump out more oil and gas. And so there's a tremendous amount of pollution from that fracking fluid to all of this industrial process. There's a great organization called Frac Tracker, and they estimate that there are 1.3 million oil and gas facilities across the United States. And they have absolutely boomed in the last 20 years as fracking has taken off, or the last 10, 15 years. So the gas that would feed the GTN Express pipeline that we're talking about today is likely coming from British Columbia and Alberta, and possibly the Western United States. And the product that comes out of this is raw natural gas. There's nothing, you know, natural about it. That was a clever way to brand it. But the natural gas, or frac gas, as we're calling it, is approximately 95% methane and some smaller amounts of other heavier hydrocarbons. Okay, next slide. So as we're working our way down the chain here, the gas is piped to a processing plant, a gas processing plant. And so this is a facility that's used to clean the raw natural gas by separating out the impurities and separating out the non-methane hydrocarbons. And it's producing what they call pipeline quality natural gas. As an aside, if we wanted to further follow this chain, it's also pulling out what's called natural gas liquids, which are things like ethane and butane and other hydrocarbons that are then used to make petrochemicals and ultimately plastics for some of them. These gas processing plants are usually located in the vicinity in the natural gas producing region. And so from the wellhead, the gas is transported to one of these processing plants through a whole, you know, spider web of low pressure gathering pipelines. And so there might be 100 wells feeding one of these processing plants. And what I want to emphasize for this slide is the amount of the danger to our climate of methane leaking into the atmosphere. You know, as you can imagine, from the fracking itself to these gathering lines to the processing plant to putting it in other pipelines, all along the process, there's methane that leaks. There's gas that leaks out of this, all of this infrastructure. And so the government of Canada has recently done some more detailed studies, and they have found that depending on the location, depending on the facility, that between 0.5% and 4.4% of the methane leaks from the system. So, on average, maybe 2% is just going up into the atmosphere. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal because methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It's 25 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So any methane that's leaking into the air is a big problem for our climate. So it's not just when, the gas is burned at the end, whether it's in a gas-fired power plant or in somebody's home, that's causing the emissions. It's every step along the way, including these so-called upstream emissions, which is the leaking from the production. Okay, so the products of this infrastructure is methane and natural gas liquids. And as I mentioned, the natural gas liquids go on to be made into petrochemicals. But let's follow the methane, and we'll get down to how this gets into the Pacific Northwest. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is a photo of a gas-fired power plant. This one is in Hermiston, Oregon. And this is what we often think of as with natural gas as the end product of burning it. And so, years ago, the gas industry was trying to say that natural gas is a bridge fuel from coal. Now we know that that it's a huge source of climate pollution, and we can't have any more fracked gas infrastructure if we're going to meet our climate goals. And so along the way from that processing plant, that gas is put into pipelines and it is shipped to different end users, including gas-fired power plants, including business and residential uses. One thing I wanted to mention with this infrastructure is storage. Gas, there are large storage facilities. Some of it is stored as liquefied natural gas, where it's super cooled and put in tanks. There's one of those in Portland. There's one on Newport on the Oregon coast. They're trying to build one in Tacoma, Washington. This isn't just for export, but this is, just to store the gas. But there's also underground storage facilities. There's a huge one in Mist, Oregon on the coast, and it's not put in tanks at all. It's a very unregulated environment where it's pumped down back into the ground to store it. And so there's leakage that's associated with that as well. Okay, but the piece of infrastructure that that we're gonna dive down into is these compressor stations. So next slide, please. Okay. So this is a map of the GTN pipeline, and there's a pipeline company called TC Energy that has a 1,300-mile pipeline that goes from British Columbia down to the Oregon-California border. TC Energy, as an aside, is the same company that brought you the Keystone XL pipeline. And on this map, this is an existing pipeline. It's one of our major interstate pipelines in the West. And the red circles are compressor stations. And the compressor stations pressurize the gas and push it through the pipelines. So the yellow circle here, the larger yellow circle, is the Coyote Springs proposed compressor station. TC Energy wants to build a new one in Boardman, Oregon. And then the three larger white circles are proposals to expand existing compressor stations. One of them is in near Post Falls, Idaho. One of them is in Southeast Washington, and one of them is near Kent, Oregon, which is a bit north of Bend, south of Boardman. So this is the GTN Xpress project that we're talking about, as well as Coyote Springs. The company, even though these are clearly linked together, they are claiming that Coyote Springs is a separate project. They've applied for a separate permit. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, who is the government agency that approves or denies pipeline permits, usually approves them, is treating Coyote Springs as a totally separate project. But we have seen some of their investor notes from their investor calls and other evidence that suggests that these are all part of one big project that is designed to expand the capacity of fracked gas into this system. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a photo of a compressor station. So these are, machines, generators that raise the pressure of gas and enable it to flow through the pipeline. And if you've never heard of compressor station, can you go to the next slide? Then you clearly don't have a subscription to Gas Compressor magazine. If you know anyone who has a birthday coming up or a Christmas gift, this could be a good subscription to get for them. But I show this slide just to emphasize that gas compression is important. It might not be part of our everyday conversations, but it is one way that you can dramatically increase the amount of gas into a system instead of building new pipelines, which have become very politically unpopular. Okay, next slide, please. And our very own project here, Coyote Springs Compressor Station, was featured in Gas Compression magazine in April. And so why are these things a big deal? In particular, Coyote Springs and GTN Xpress. I mean, first of all, they increase the amount of fracked gas shipped into our region. It is insane for us to keep building new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to draw a line in the sand. Both of the GTN Xpress and Coyote Springs, these compressor stations, will increase our greenhouse gas emissions at a time when we need to desperately decrease them. It's a step in the exact opposite direction that we need to go. And these are big projects. Next slide, please. Just wanted to share a couple facts here. The projects would increase the capacity by 250,000 decatherms a day, which is enough gas to serve over 1 million homes. To put that in perspective, the Kalama methanol refinery that we were fighting and successfully fought together with a whole coalition of organizations and many others was 300,000 decatherms per day, approximately. A LNG export terminal like the ones on the Columbia or Jordan Cove were about 1.2 million. So these are big. This is a major increase in frack gas into our region. Seeing lots of questions come up. Let me just go through a couple more here, and then maybe we can stop for some questions. Oh, the other thing on this slide, that the social cost of carbon. This was an estimate, right? Not an estimate. This was a calculation from FERC itself. The social cost of carbon is an estimate in dollars of the economic damages that would result from emitting an additional ton of carbon dioxide. So, huge amount of economic damage from this project by building more frack gas infrastructure. And just to be clear, they are not building new pipelines. This is I don't want to ascribe to any to saying what their motives are, but it is extremely difficult to build new pipelines in the Pacific Northwest and many other regions because people are fighting to protect our climate, and we don't need new pipelines. We don't want new fossil fuel. This project has largely flown under the radar, more so than a big new pipeline, because it is a different way of doing it. It is building and increasing the size of these compressor stations, but the end result is the same. The end result is more fossil fuels and locking in fossil fuels for decades into our system. Okay, Next slide, please. So this again is from some numbers from the environmental impact statement that was recently released by FERC, and this is for the GTN Xpress, which is just the 3 expansion compressor stations. So it would increase greenhouse gas emissions in Idaho by 16%, Washington by almost 4%, and Oregon by over 7% every year. This is the exact opposite direction that our laws require decreasing emissions in Washington by 95%, Oregon by 75% in the next 30 years. I mean, that seems far off, but we need to be making substantial gains every year. And we obviously must be decreasing, not increasing. So, even though this project hasn't gained the media attention of something like a LNG terminal or the nation's largest coal export terminal that was proposed along the Columbia, it is another example of a dangerous new fossil fuel infrastructure project. So that's the overview of what it is and some of the concerns. It's great to see folks from all over who have direct connection with some of these locations or have worked on some of these climate issues throughout the Pacific Northwest, and welcome everybody. I'm going to hand it over to Columbia Riverkeeper staff attorney, Audrey Leonard, to talk about the permitting process and the FERC process that we're involved right now. And then we'll hand it back to Anna Molina, Riverkeeper's field manager, to discuss how everybody can get involved. So back to you, Audrey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Brett said, I'm Audrey Leonard. I am thrilled to be joining Columbia Riverkeeper as their newest staff attorney and excited to be working on this project. So as Brett mentioned, FERC is the agency that is charged with writing this environmental impact statement that will inform their approval or denial of the project. And this is a document that should analyze the various environmental impacts of the proposed project in enough detail so that the agency can make an appropriate decision. Unfortunately, FERC's analysis is not as thorough as it should be, and it discounts or fails to consider entirely some important aspects of this project. The agency is taking public comment on the EIS until August 22nd, and we're writing detailed comments identifying areas that FERC overlooked so the agency has enough information to deny the expansion. And it's always helpful to have as many comments as possible to show the agency how important this is. So we need your help. Next slide. So the first issue with the EIS is the project purpose. GTN is required to provide a purpose for its project, and here its stated purpose is to expand the capacity and increase gas transmission. However, there's no demonstrated need for this purpose, especially in light of Washington, Oregon, and California's climate and energy policies moving away from frack gas. This project is simply incompatible with those goals. And a project of this magnitude shouldn't stand without a sufficient purpose. Second, FERC needs to look into how the GTN project will affect ratepayers. If FERC approves, ratepayers will end up fronting those expansion costs, and that doesn't make sense when demand is decreasing and putting those costs on fewer individuals. Next slide, please. And the third point that I'll highlight for you, FERC has to look at climate change impacts as part of its environmental analysis. To get a full picture of the project's climate change impacts, FERC must calculate and consider greenhouse gas emissions. This includes both downstream and upstream emissions. Downstream emissions occur at the project's output and can be quantified by looking at how much capacity is increased. This project will create downstream emissions of 3.24 million tons of CO2 emissions annually, which is substantial. And this is just the GTN expansion, not the Coyote Springs. In addition to downstream emissions, upstream emissions are associated with extracting and processing the fracked gas that is fed into the pipeline system. And those upstream emissions are important, as Brett mentioned, because scientific reviews of natural gas production have increasingly found that extraction and processing lead to substantial amounts of methane, which is the primary component of natural gas, and even more potent than CO2 at causing global warming. And in FERC's analysis, it claims that it cannot quantify those upstream emissions, and it leaves out a significant portion of the equation. However, we believe that it is possible to quantify those upstream emissions using existing scientific information and data. Our expert calculated that the project will result in 0.65 million tons of emissions, which is another 20% of the emissions that FERC calculated and considered. So these are just a few of the many flaws in FERC's environmental analysis, and we hope that with enough public input, our concerns will be heard and FERC will understand the full extent of the negative impacts from this project and issue a denial. And with that, I'll hand it over to Anna to kick off the Q&A.
Thank you, Audrey and Brett, for just going over what is GTN and why we're so concerned about it. If I can have you both come on camera, that would be great. And we got a lot of questions in the chat, so I tried to compile all of them in a document for me. So some of the ones that we have a question from Paul. He's curious about the scale of the infrastructure and how many of the processing facilities are forecasted to be connected to this GTN pipeline. If they're, and approximately like how many wells are connected to a processing plant, if we have that information. I'll put it in the chat so people can see.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So, you know, it varies greatly, but there can be approximately 1,000 of the different wells connected to processing plants. You know, obviously depends on the size of the well and the size of the processing plant. And for this project, you know, it is the already processed gas that is put into the GTN pipeline. So it's coming out of various processing plants. The company has claimed that the gas would come from the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, which is primarily for us, British Columbia and Alberta, but you know, it could come from anywhere in the West. There is, as you know, a lot of fracking in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and so that's where the gas is coming from. And then for the compressor stations, you know, this is an existing pipeline, and so there's existing compressor stations along the line. But you know, I frankly didn't understand. I mean, we'd worked on compressor stations, especially for some of the LNG pipelines that were proposed. You know, there was compressor stations to feed those, and working with a lot of landowners who were threatened with them in a domain. Some of them had compressor stations on their property proposed, and including one who felt like it was retaliation because it wasn't on his property, and then it got, you know, on the map anyways, it got moved to his property because he was one of the leading activists opposing it. But you know, we knew how important these were, but didn't really understand, or at least I didn't in that level of detail, how, you know, relatively I don't want to say minor, but, you know, by increasing the capacity from just several compressor stations can move so much more gas. And this pipeline was, you know, some of it was built in the 1960s. There's definitely safety concerns about increasing the pressure of the gas that much. And so anyways, back to the compressor stations, there are existing compressor stations on this line that we were showing on that map, but they would be building one new one and expanding 3. And we don't know exactly where the gas is coming from, or exactly which wells or, you know, processing plants it would be coming from.
Thank you, Brett. So we have another question. Has anyone computed the probable emissions in CO2 from fracking through the processing, transmission, and combustion of the fuel, such as Oil Change International undertook for the Pacific Connector Jordan Cove project?
Audrey, do you want to do that one?
Sure. So we have an expert that's looking at the upstream emissions of the GTN expansion proposal, and that's not including the Coyote Springs compressor. But that's one calculation that FERC overlooked. FERC did its own analysis of the downstream emissions, which is where looking at the output of this expansion, but we were able to calculate the number that they're overlooking and add that to the total.
So the total is FERC's EIS, which our expert looks at and thinks that they did a reasonable job of calculating the emissions from when it's being burned, was 3 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and then the upstream emissions that FERC failed to calculate is approximately another 500,000 tons of CO2. So by failing to look at the upstream, the leakage of methane that we talked about, it was reduced by about 20%. So in total, about 3.5 million tons of CO2 is the estimate. So it's probably not in the same level of detail as that Jordan Cove report by Oil Change International, but we're relying on some of the FERC data for the kind of combustion data of how much the 3 million tons of how much CO2 is being emitted from that side of things.
And one quick reason why that getting that number correct is so important is because part of the analysis requires FERC to look at the cumulative impacts of this project. So not only this project itself, but anything that's going on around it. And you have to get that number right in order to meaningfully assess the full impact of the project.
Thank you. And I think you all touched on some of it, but by which percentage does TC Energy intend to increase the volume in its GTN pipeline? And in terms of explosions, how risky is increased volume in this pipeline? And then also, what is the age of the GTN pipeline? For either Brett or Audrey.
I can start on a couple of those. The age was, part of it was built in the 1960s. There was some that was built in the 1990s. The percentage of increase, I'm gonna do some quick math here right now. I might need to get back to you on that, but there's some of the questions that we'll need to get back to you on. For getting the full capacity, I think it's 2.9 million, which would be about a 10% increase, but let me confirm that.
Okay.
What were the other questions? Sorry.
I think I was just asking for the percentage that TC is intending to increase the volume of, and in terms of explosions, how risky is this increased volume in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we don't know, I think is the short answer. There is some analysis of that by FERC. we've been focusing on some of the climate impacts because those we know, but we've all certainly seen pipelines explode. We've seen the damage that has caused, both in small or larger scale. This is a big pipeline system, and it's an old pipeline system. So increasing the pressure by this amount clearly creates some concerns. I don't know how to quantify those, but it's certainly a new risk.
Definitely. And I think maybe along with that risk, another question that we have is there a possibility that TC Energy, after this upgrade, could ask to transport more gas than what is in their FERC permit?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the classic thing that we're concerned about, is some of this piecemealing. They're already doing it. In fact, these very compressor stations, they did some, what they were calling maintenance improvements a few years ago, and overbuilt them. And now they want to ship additional gas. And it's essentially, for some of them, some software upgrades where they can ship more gas. And so by taking this in a piecemeal approach, by separating Coyote Springs is definitely piecemealing this, meaning doing it piece by piece and not looking at the full overall cumulative impact as the law requires, is a problem. But also, there's nothing to stop them from coming back next year and applying to increase the pressure even more, or to do it to the other compressor stations. I don't know the physical constraints on that, right? I mean, at some point you need to stop on that. But as far as from FERC and the legal side of things, they can get piecemealed permits one at a time. They're supposed to disclose any, foreseeable impacts, but they're saying Coyote Springs isn't a foreseeable connection to this when it's a compressor station that's built literally on the same pipeline. So I don't have a lot of faith that they're, disclosing future plans either.
Definitely, we've seen this tactic before. And we have another question. This is more of like a broader question, but how does the recent Senate passed Inflation Reduction Bill affect FERC permitting of pipelines and this project? If you have any comments or on that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is not part of the pipelines that Senator Manchin got into there as more likely to be built in that bill, in our climate bill. But I don't think it affects FERC's FERC permitting that I'm aware of. I mean, it does a lot of really good things of putting more money into renewables, and I'm sure there's some connection of hoping that we wouldn't need more gas because we're investing more into clean energy. But for this project, which is already been applied for, I don't see a connection for that. There is really important FERC policy happening right now, where FERC is reevaluating some of its how it makes decisions, and that would include how it's looking at climate impacts, how it's looking at impacts to landowners who are affected by eminent domain, and there's been some good proposals of modernizing FERC instead of just approving every pipeline and letting the market decide if we need them. That is an ongoing process at FERC, but I'm not aware of that legislation impacting any of that.
Thank you. And then an easier question, because I know I've been throwing out some really hardball questions from
Those were hard.
from our audience. So we're all very engaged and very knowledgeable. I see a lot of comments in our chat of just like background information that people have. So this one's just a little bit easier in case anybody missed it. But is FERC the ultimate decider, and is there a time frame for this pipeline permit? Audrey?
Yeah, so FERC needs to be able to review all of the public comments that are due August 22nd. So we would expect a decision probably a while after that gives FERC enough time to decide and consider all of those comments that we brought up and look into the new analysis that we put in front of them. They also have to meaningfully respond to our comments on those. So we would be expecting a decision probably maybe around October.
Thank you. So I guess
FERC is the final decision maker for as far as agencies for this. So the Natural Gas Act, which is a federal statute, gives FERC the exclusive jurisdiction over interstate pipelines. So there's not a series of other agencies that are at the federal level anyways, making permits on this or decisions. Of course, there's endangered species issues if those are involved, and those agencies are weighing in. EPA put in some really good comments and raised a lot of serious concerns. There's also some state level permitting for this project, but FERC is the ultimate decision maker on the pipeline. It's called the Certificate of Convenience and Necessity that FERC would issue, and that can be appealed. The appeal process is first appealing it to ask FERC to reconsider it, which is called a request for rehearing. And then after that, it's appealed to circuit court. So it could be appealed directly to, say, the Ninth Circuit, where the facility is located.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a, there's a lot of moving pieces here, but FERC already approved the Coyote Springs and the GTN Xpress, as Anna and Audrey said, FERC is evaluating right now. And so we need to, push FERC to deny the GTN Xpress and hopefully get some other, perhaps the states to raise concerns about that as well. And then, we are considering an appeal of the Coyote Springs approval, which would be due at the end of this month.
Okay. We have a lot more questions than we have a lot of time for, so we're going to take a couple more minutes for some of these questions. Francis had asked, this might be a little bit one of those hardball questions, but since Jordan Cove would have taken a large amount of OG gas from GTN, with the fall of Jordan Cove, one would think there would be less need for expansion, not more. How is the need justified in light of no Jordan Cove for this pipeline? Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Francis, and thank you for all of your work in defeating Jordan Cove. Else it would be definitely more justified, along with other pipelines. But yeah, their justification is increased demand. They point to some of the utilities, including around Bend area, as increasing demand. They one of the shippers on here is called Tourmaline, which is an oil and gas company. So they're fracking and then shipping it somewhere. So they're not required to say exactly where it's going, but the TC Energy's explanation is that there's increasing demand which is, hard to reconcile with the gas consumption has been relatively flat. And if we have policies that allow for building more gas and more gas consumption, then there might be increased demand. But if we do what's necessary and stick with our policies that are calling for a dramatic decrease, then it's completely incompatible with state law. And that's one of the things that has gathered some national attention about this GTN Xpress. And there's been some other pipelines on the East Coast that advocates like us have made the same argument that, look, FERC, you have to consider our state policies that are calling for a decrease in demand. You can't ignore those because that's a really important part of the future. We're trying to team up with some of the other advocates that are working on these issues as well to try to make that loud and clear to FERC.
Definitely. Okay, we have maybe 5 more minutes for questions. It was a long question period, but we had a lot of really great ones. I think somebody just wants to get a point clarified if they're understanding it correctly. The new compressor stations will be the way the pipeline increases its production. If you can just clarify that a little.
Yeah, it would be increasing the amount of gas that can go through the pipeline. Yeah, so the pipeline would stay the same size, but if you increase the pressure, you can push more gas through the pipeline. So increase, we've been saying increase the capacity. I guess the production would be another way of saying that, which leads to more fracking and that whole everything along the chain.
Great. And so I guess with a follow-up on that question, somebody else had asked, so does that increase in pressure mean an increase in danger along the pipeline? Potentially.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly more gas moving through. If there was a breach or rupture, it would be under higher pressure. So there's certainly a risk of having that higher pressure result in more danger.
Okay, we have, I think, one last question. I think it was one. What Washington state legislation might affect this work? I know you had mentioned a little bit of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the frustrating answer is that, FERC is not looking at Washington legislation or considering the Washington, legislation that has been passed in a series of bills over the last several years. It's, that's not controlling the FERC process or its FERC decision making, and it's not really controlling how much gas is moving through pipelines. That legislation in Oregon as well is designed at reducing emissions on the combustion side of things. So there's a real disconnect there, and none of these greenhouse gas bills are perfect, and they're sometimes overlooking pieces, but that's unfortunately it's not controlled. Washington's laws and goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions are not controlling on FERC's decision making here directly, but FERC should certainly consider and analyze the impact of adding more gas and not meeting our climate goals. And FERC should take, that should be part of FERC's policy of we're not going to approve projects that are inconsistent with state law.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Audrey, for answering these hardball questions that we had from our very engaged audience today. We had more questions than we actually have a lot of time to answer. So the questions we didn't get to, we'll try to answer them maybe in an FAQ, putting something like that out. But for now, I'm going to wrap up that that question portion. And now we'll get to the portion of how do you engage in this campaign. Columbia Riverkeeper has a long history of winning on our campaigns, and that's all because of folks like you who show up and throw down for these campaigns, for stopping these fossil fuel infrastructure projects. And so one of the first things you can do is by signing the following petition we have to FERC. We have it listed on our website, and I'll share the link in the chat for you all as well. We want to have 5,000 signatures to send to FERC to make our voices heard. So please share it with your networks, and we have until August 20th to send these petition signatures to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then the second way that you can engage in this campaign as well is by writing a letter to your editor, and to your local newspaper to get the word out about this pipeline. I did see a comment that why it doesn't seem like a lot of people have heard about this pipeline. It's been very under the radar. So we need to be able to make more noise about this so that our elected officials, our community know about it and can join us in this fight against this expansion on this pipeline. And so by writing a letter to your editor and putting it in the newspaper gets the word out. And so if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor, we have a letter to the editor guide that I'll share in the chat as well for you to go check out. It'll be posted on our website, and it'll be sent in our follow-up email after this webinar, and we'll have a recording of it for you as well, so you can share. And we want to get letters to the editors published in both Oregon, Washington, and California, because this is where that's the pipeline route. So to wrap us up for today, I want to thank you all for joining this webinar on GTN and how to be involved in this campaign. The best way to empower this work is to become a member of Columbia Riverkeeper today. And you can do that with a one-time or a recurring donation on our website or over the phone. And the link to our donate page is shared in the chat. So thank you again for joining, and have a great day. Bye, everybody.